Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Stan Grant. We're coming to you live from Sydney tonight, and joining me on the panel, co-founder of Instagram news site The Daily Aus, Zara Seidler, Minister for Communications and the Arts, Paul Fletcher, Shadow Minister for Education, Tanya Plibersek, former National Cybersecurity Advisor, Alastair MacGibbon, who is now Chief Strategy Officer at cyber firm CyberCX, and journalist and documentary maker, Marc Fennell. It's fantastic to have you all here in the room.
My question is, why does the federal government continually block efforts to install an independent anti-corruption commission?
I'm actually going to hold it on you, Paul, for a minute and go to you, Tanya, on this. And there was a proposal, wasn't there, from Helen Haines, an independent, setting out just this type of body. Why didn't Labor fully get behind that?
Well, we went to the last election saying that there would be a federal Anti-Corruption Commission if we had been elected. We think there's a lot of merit in Helen's proposal, and we've been working with her.
But it's dead now for lack of support.
Well, we would like to see a really strong, functioning federal integrity body. And what Paul is proposing, what his government's proposing, wouldn't be allowed to investigate complaints made from whistleblowers. It wouldn't be allowed to decide on its own to investigate a matter that it's interested in. It couldn't look at anything that had happened before the body was established. And a lot of judicial figures and others would tell you that what the government's proposing is weaker, is worse than having nothing at all, because in fact you could refer things off to this toothless tiger and they'll just disappear. The government will be able to say, oh, well, that's been referred off, nothing to see here, and who knows if we ever hear of those issues again. That's
the criticism of what the government's putting forward. And I say before, Helen Haines had a proposal as well that would have had public hearings, could have followed up from whistleblowers, a lot of the things that you've outlined. So you're talking about something that is similar to a standing royal commission.
Well,
what's the meat on the bone? What is the detail?
I think the problem with simply referring these things off to royal commissions is if you are a member of the public and you hear of some corrupt behaviour, or you are, you witness corrupt behaviour, who do you report it to if there isn't a royal commission at the time? That's why I think it's very important to have a standing anti-corruption body that can decide on its own to investigate issues that it's interested in, can take reports from anonymous whistleblowers, can make findings of corruption. I think Paul's model, it wouldn't even be able to make findings of corruption. I do respect this idea that people are innocent till proven guilty. I understand why people are concerned about that, but the response to that is not to have a weak, half-assed approach that really does nothing to address corruption.
Paul, respond to that.
Well, our proposal for a Commonwealth Integrity Commission will have the powers of a standing royal commission the same powers as a royal commission to investigate criminal corruption at the Commonwealth level. So there's a serious mechanism that we've proposed. There's almost $150 million in funding that we've got committed for it. We've been working through a serious methodical process. Exposure draft last year.
It certainly has been methodical. It's been a very, very long time.
Because these are important design issues. And we have seen in New South Wales, and we've seen other instances of problems with design flaws in organisations like ICAC. So it's important that we get this right. Ultimately, we've got a serious mechanism there. But we do believe that there are significant challenges with the way ICAC operates, essentially the reversal of the presumption of innocence. And we don't want to see that replicated at the Commonwealth level. That's why we've carefully designed a mechanism that we believe will be effective, and we're working carefully through a consultation process.
Well, nobody else thinks it's going to be effective, though.
Zara, what do young people think? Because a lot of young people, of course, reading your news site. Are people really exercised about this now after Gladys Berejiklian's resignation?
They certainly are. And I just wanted to say to the Minister's point that I think that the episode with Gladys Berejiklian last week really moved it from an abstract concept of this random policy idea that young people couldn't really sink their teeth into a very genuine policy framework that will be really, really pivotal at the next federal election. So I think that young people are really yearning for some sort of trust relationship with the government. And when young people see...
Is that lacking now? Are they saying that there's a lack of of trust?
I think that would be a euphemistic way to put it, Stan. I think that young people are significantly underwhelmed, would be the way I'd put it, with the way that politicians and the political class more generally.
And this is not partisan, this is not just one side.
No, I mean, absolutely. So we at the Daily Aus put a poll to our audience. We've got 250,000 young people and 81% of respondents. So that was something like 37,000 people said that they would like a federal ICAC tomorrow. And I think that that's significant in and of itself. It's young people caring, we're the next generation of voters, and it's going to be a big federal election issue.
Marc, you know, people can say we want this and we want it now and we want to hold politicians accountable. But then when you look at something like New South Wales ICAC, and 3 premiers now have gone as a result of these investigations, and then we see people leaving flowers outside Gladys Berejiklian's office and saying, why did you have to go, Gladys? Is there sort of mixed messages here from the public?
Well, I think it's important to note that Gladys resigned. I think some of the language around this is a bit confusing. Gladys chose to leave. Now, the circumstances around that are worth debating. I think they are. Look, the conversation around ICAC and Gladys is really fascinating to me because I think there's a slight difference of opinion around Gladys inside New South Wales as opposed to outside New South Wales. I think people outside of New South Wales are quite confused as to why there is so much love for her. And I think her case is really specific because I think there was a sense to a large degree within New South Wales that she was trying to get a balance right between managing COVID and also sort of, you know, people's mental health, people's businesses. And I think...
But Marc, this wasn't about this.
No, I'm getting to it. I think that adds to why people liked her. It makes it a lot easier to focus on that when the issues around ICAC are so confusing. This case around her and ICAC is a genuinely confusing one to follow. And I think that's possibly why Gladys's case is confusing because her competency around COVID was really clear, but the issues around COVID are a lot harder to follow. So I'm not sure she's necessarily the best test case for whether or not an ICAC should be rolled out nationally because she's
an
complicated.
interesting test case, right? Because there are unintended consequences associated with some of these things, right? There are people's lives that can be destroyed and years later be exonerated. She didn't choose to resign because she felt like it was a good time to go.
No.
She left because she felt there was no other option.
She'd also set a precedent that if you're being investigated by ICAC, you have to quit.
Right, and she lost her job as a result.
But the other public policy issue, as well as the very valid considerations that Alastair raises about people's reputation and whether they get a fair hearing and proper process, is that as a consequence of the way ICAC has operated, we've had a very successful Premier doing an outstanding job, leading a state through a really challenging situation, put in a position where she decided she had no choice but to resign. And so that needs to weigh up in the mix as you work out the institutional design that you think is appropriate.
But there can be a pro-Gladys sentiment, or people can like her, and there can still be questions to ask, as clearly there are in this case, Tanya.
I think that's exactly the point. You can like and respect a person, but if they have done the wrong thing, it doesn't mean that they're above the rules. Nobody's above the rules.
Under your model, or Labor's proposed model, and we're yet to see the full detail on this, would this be the expectation of everyone who was brought before it, that you have to resign or step aside?
Well, I think it's way too early to speculate on things like that. What we want to see is a strong integrity commission that does allow whistleblowers to make complaints, that is able to
But we know how easily that can be
bat.
politicised, Alastair, can't we? And if this is a test case, and if there are some precedents here, if you have people saying, well, how come Minister X doesn't step aside when Gladys Berejiklian stepped aside or resigned when she was brought before ICAC? You can see what you're setting up here, can't you, Alastair?
Well, one of the topics tonight, of course, is the internet. Go and look on the Twitter threads on people's presumption of guilt well prior to any form of fair and due process. And all I would urge Minister and opposition to do is, if something is set up, that there is a fair process, that it's swift, there's a chance for people to actually put their case, but for and against, and that there is an opportunity for people to be exonerated quickly. There are too many lives destroyed. And again, I just want to say, I'm not pro-corruption, but you know, people make decisions, and sometimes those decisions are going to be judged by an electorate or by a court as wrong and bad. That's fine. I just don't think the solution is always a corruption inquiry.
Zara?
I keep hearing this, and I'm really curious because, I mean, at least from an outsider's perspective, we got notification from ICAC that the investigation had expanded to include the former Premier, and then mere minutes later, we had the Premier coming out with her resignation. So what is this subversion of the presumption of innocence that we are seeing online, because there wasn't really that window even online for people? I know that...
But are you saying her resignation is an admission of guilt? Because that's what it sounds like, right? Because she hasn't... She resigned because she had no option.
She has set an expectation with other ministers in the past that if you are suddenly the focus of ICAC...
That you step aside.
That you step aside.
Which may well then carry over into whatever federal body we see as well.
Of course.
Recently, whistleblower Frances Haugen alleged Facebook are putting growth and profits ahead of the health of its users. What needs to be done to regulate social media giants to ensure that they act in the interests of the moral good and not just their own?
Yeah, Zara, what can be done? We've seen recently a High Court judgment here making publishers liable for comment that is put online, and that must be affecting how you operate as well.
It is a really big issue for us. So we are a very small publisher, we're a very small team, and it is providing this impossible task. We are to have 24-hour moderation. As I said earlier, we have 250,000 people who are freely commenting, and if we're then going to be liable, that's not an option. And so we are going to have to turn off our comment section. And that's a real shame, because that is where some of the healthiest conversations...
Also some of the unhealthiest.
It is certainly, but I think that it also provides a really great opportunity to lead people in different directions. So often, if somebody is to contribute something that might be unhealthy, a lot of our other followers will jump in and say, well, actually, here's what I think, here are the resources that I rely on. And it becomes this engagement. And just on the Voller High Court decision, the other thing I'll say is that I think it's a really, really disappointing outcome, because I think it will squander media innovation. I don't know why any new publishers would try to enter this space when the barrier to entry is so high. And I think that that's doing a great disservice to the media landscape in our country.
Marc, how do we deal with something like this? I mean, you know, information moves so quickly. People can go online, they can comment anonymously, they can say whatever they like. Someone somewhere needs to be responsible for it, but whom? Under what circumstances?
Well, government has a role to play. Certainly the Australian government has been active in this space for a while. I'd also note that at the moment the US and Europe are being quite active in this space. And I think government is an important tool, but ultimately I think it does come down to Facebook. In this particular instance, it comes down to Facebook, because what Zara was describing there is really interesting. She can turn off comments, right? But the moment Zara does that, her engagement as a brand vanishes. And that's where so much of your business is built. It's built on engagement. So as much as Facebook and other organisations can say, hey, turn off comments, there's an inbuilt mechanism in there that's going to damage all the brands that are on there. So the choices and the decisions of how to find a pathway out of this, they are Facebook's. And, you know, the whistleblower stuff that came out over the last couple of weeks, I will confess, is not super surprising to people that have been following this space for a long time. And I guess the distinction here is that Facebook have really struggled to, I think, accept responsibility for their role as an agent of social change. And I think now we're entering a phase where for the longest time, they defended themselves as, we're not a publisher, we're a platform. And I think everybody now surely has to acknowledge that what happens on Facebook changes culture, and they have to accept some responsibility.
That's a very different business model, Alastair, isn't it? And if you're talking about that, you're talking about then the end of something like Facebook as we know it.
Well, I'm just going to call it as they've strip-mined the internet without any understanding of the consequences of their actions. They've been dragged since 2016 and the Russian interference in the US presidential elections to the concept of having to be at least partly responsible for the information that is displayed on their many sites to the billions of people that use it. When you make as much profit as a company like Facebook does, don't tell me that putting a few $100 million into doing some form of enforcement, protecting people, is actually a fair equation. It's just not. People are harmed through this, whether it's our democracy, which frankly is our greatest asset as a nation, If that's undermined through the inability of one of these sites to actually do what is socially responsible, then that's a huge travesty. If a young person is harmed because of actions that they could have prevented as a company, they should be ashamed. And they're not becoming socially responsible. They're being forced into it by the Australian Parliament.
Well, as we heard from the whistleblower as well, that he's actively harmed.
They know the harm.
If you think about, you know, if you said, I've got a business, I've got 200 billboards all around Sydney, all around Melbourne, and anybody who comes to me and wants to put on those billboards, you know, Paul Fletcher is a lying crook, I'll let them do that. And then when I complain, you didn't stop this person putting this on the billboards, they say, oh, that's not our business model.
I can't enforce it. It's too big. I've got too many billboards.
The Prime Minister today,
we would not accept that.
Just picking up on that, the Prime Minister today said that these social media cowards need to be made to pay. But how do you pay? At the same time, you have Michaelia Cash saying that in relation to the High Court hearing, that there needs to be reform of defamation, which would not put the onus on the publisher for the comments that are being made. How do those two things go together?
So in relation to defamation, there's a couple of things happening. First, the High Court case really applied some long-standing common law principles and said if you have a Facebook page, you're liable for the comments on it. It says that about the news media businesses like 7 and 9 that happen to own those or operate those Facebook pages. It was actually silent about whether Facebook has any liability. At the same time as that, the State Attorneys General, led by Mark Speakman, the New South Wales Attorney General, they've been leading a process looking at these issues. They put out a good discussion paper earlier this year, and Michaelia Cash just today has called for that work to be speeded up. So there's a process underway to look at these very issues. What I think we've been reminded of is just the importance of that.
But how do you get that balance right? I mean, it is the balance, isn't it, Tanya, between what is free speech and what is not, and how do you vet that and who is responsible?
Yeah, the car's a fantastic invention made better with seatbelts. I feel the same way about social media. It's wonderful that people can talk directly to each other. They can, I mean, look at the influence of social media communication during the Arab Spring or other pro-democracy movements. You know, people often say, well, if only you had to attach your name, the sort of comments would be moderated. That's probably true in Australia, but if you apply that same rule in a country with a repressive government, suddenly you've got a whole different problem.
But does this mean that it comes? You raised this in your essay, Paul, about sovereignty, and Facebook's a virtual nation, right, unto itself, and it crosses.
It's richer than many nations.
Yeah,
It operates.
Yes and no. I mean, they have offices here. They operate in our legal environment.
And that's the point. That's the point I was going to come to, and anyone can pick up this point. What would stop Australia saying, if you're on Twitter, for instance, you need to be identified, your name and your face. And if you want to smear people and attack people, we'll know exactly who you are.
Stan,
we're not talking about the Arab Spring. We're talking about Australia where people can be... What's wrong with that?
I'd like people to have to declare their age as well. I think the problems with online gambling and really violent pornography being accessed at a younger and younger age have massive social consequences.
Can I just pick up a couple of those points? Firstly, in terms of identity, the eSafety Commissioner under the new Online Safety Act will have powers to require the platforms to disclose information that they have about a user, such as an IP address and so on, because there's this perception at the moment that you're completely anonymous online. In fact, that's not true. So with those additional powers, there will be instances where she will be able to, Julie Inman-Grant, a very highly respected eSafety Commissioner, doing a great job and now backed with significant additional resources, in fact 120 million of funding over the next 4 years, as well as the new powers in the Act. And one of those new powers, as I say, is to require the provision of that information. So if there's a particular instance of trolling, she's now got new powers to deal with serious cyber abuse of an Australian adult. That's new. We've had cyberbullying laws to deal with children since 2015. Alastair was the first eSafety Commissioner and they've worked effectively. We're now expanding that to adults, and the eSafety Commissioner will administer that. What people say to us is, when you've been the victim of vicious online abuse, overwhelmingly the first thing you want is to get that taken down. And a takedown order from the e-Safety Commissioner requires the platforms to take it down.
What about groups of people, though? I mean, this is for individuals. You take down specific incidents of online abuse, but what about racist abuse online? That's something that we've asked about before, Paul, and there's really... We haven't had an answer from the government about that.
So the whole structure here is that if the content is determined to meet that test, if it's a reasonable person would consider it was intended to cause harm, then it'll meet the test of being cyberbullying material or serious cyber abuse of an Australian adult, and certainly factors like a racial element will absolutely be considered.
But for individuals, I'm talking about groups of people.
Yeah, if you've got waves and waves and waves of this, I mean, part of the issue when you're on the receiving end of that is just it's a wall. It's an absolute wall, and it's not about an individual. To actually go through and granularly, which is not a word, but let's imagine that it is, pick out that person is a huge onus suddenly on the victim.
Or to just rely on the operator to self-regulate and remove people.
It's not self-regulation because they'll be under order and they'll have to do it. But it's what you're talking about is what are called volumetric attacks, which can often bounce between platforms as well. So it's a definite pattern, and the e-Safety Commissioner is very alive to that, and she believes she's got the powers to deal with that under the Act we've
Let's move on to our next question.
I have a high proportion of people in my family who are conspiracy theorists, anti-lockdown mask or vax, or at the very least vaccine hesitant. This includes some close relatives who are showing some worrying signs of delusion with conspiracy theory overtones. I'm the only person in my family with a formal higher education. I've become a misinformation translator, fact provider, and vaccine advocate, but I'm very tired. Apprehension to speak about the conspiracy theorist side has left a gaping hole of knowledge for working class, non-formally educated Australians that misinformation is filling. How do we fix this? How do we speak in a language everyone can understand?
And Marc, it's not just a question of being educated as well. Education is not always an indicator of wisdom or intelligence either. No. But, you know, everybody is vulnerable to this.
I think some of the most effective stuff I've actually seen in the last couple of months has been arming friends and family with how to communicate, basically arming the Cleos of Australia with giving them information so that they can communicate it on a one-to-one. I think one of the really important things to understand about particularly sort of anti-vax sort of misinfo is that usually there's a sense when people have become anti-vaxxers, I'm speaking in like very broad strokes terms here, so I know it's individual for every person, but there's a sense that when they've gone off and kind of acquired those views that it's because they went off and did their own research, that there's a sense of discovery that's part of it. And I think that means that it's more tightly held as a belief system. So to unpick that with an advertising campaign or to unpick that with some nice graphics on the New South Wales Health or, you know, the Victorian Health Instagram page will only get you so far. I think you actually do need to arm the friends and family around those people, but I think that tends to expose some real issues, some real gaps, in our, some knowledge gaps in our society because, as Cleo said, she's tired and she's probably not the only one. So for me, I think that's, you know, at this really crucial stage in our vaccine rollout where we are seeing like quite high vaccine numbers in various parts of the country, but there are going to be these pockets. I think it is going to come down to friends and family and giving them every resource we can so that they can speak into those social groups and communicate that extra last step.
Let's raise Craig Kelly. Tanya, shall we?
Well, yeah. First of all, I want to say thanks to Cleo. It is hard to be that person, and we're really grateful to her and to people like her for standing up and speaking in favour of vaccination. It just drives me crazy. I've not yet heard our Prime Minister say Craig Kelly, George Christensen, they're wrong when they say that vaccines don't matter, masks don't help, the lockdowns aren't doing any good. It is so important to have leadership at that level.
And we've been very clear that it's the Chief Medical Officer, it's the Health Minister, these are the people who are providing authoritative, reliable advice. And, you know, we're now at 81% first doses, obviously further to go, but a huge amount of effort gone into providing accurate, fact-based information for Australians. And look, I take Marc's point. People get their information from a range of sources, and friends and family and people you know are an important source of information.
But so are parliamentarians.
Sure.
And a parliamentarian went after my school last night, my old school, Mariah College, because they have put out to parents that they would like extended family members to be vaccinated. And so it's all well and good to say that we should arm all these, great community members with the facts, but if the people at the top of our political system are still there spewing misinformation, how are we to have confidence that there is anything
And they've
done
got a
about
communications budget to do it, that they are funded by taxpayers to communicate with their electorates, and they're giving them wrong and dangerous information. It is so immoral.
Minister, you instructed your department to look into this, didn't you? To look into these messages.
The Therapeutic
What's come out of that?
No, the Therapeutic Goods Administration has pursued this, and they're pursuing it on the grounds of the Commonwealth Criminal Code and copyright matters, on the basis of a inaccurate rendering of a government report. So quite misleading. So the Therapeutic Goods Administration, this is where our source of expertise sits within the government. Of course, they're the ones who approve vaccines.
But your reporters are saying that you had asked your department to look into the matter as well. Is that correct?
Well, we obviously went through a whole of government coordination process to identify how we were going to deal with this.
But where's that at?
Well, it's the Therapeutic Goods Administration is taking it forward as the area with subject matter expertise within the government. Just as, for example, on the question of misinformation in an election context, the Australian Electoral Commission engages with social media platforms. They did so ahead of the 2019 election. They'll do so ahead of the next election. So misinformation in different contexts, there are appropriate, relevant regulators with subject matter expertise.
Like the regulator that stopped the death tax lie during the last election, like that.
Well, we'll start. If we go down there, we'll end up chewing up the rest of the program.
To Marc's point, and I think this is probably the first time influencers have been discussed on Q&A, but there's a first for everything. I was really, really pleased to see Instagram launch a campaign recently that was arming influencers, who a lot of young people are listening to, with tools to be able to identify misinformation. And I think it goes to Marc's point about who we are arming with these tools.
Thank you. And that's all we have time for. Thanks again to our panel, Zara Seidler, Paul Fletcher, Tanya Plibersek, Alastair MacGibbon and Marc Fennell. Thank you again for all of your questions. Next week, Virginia Trioli will be with you live from Melbourne, and I'll see you on China Tonight on Monday evening. Till then, have a good night.